Standing in the marble-floored bedroom of her husband's fortress-like mansion, Vivian Hale stared at the two packed suitcases by the door and made a promise to herself. Tonight, she would either reclaim her life or lose herself forever. Roman Viscari, the man whose name made corporate rivals sweat and politicians bow, sat downstairs in his study, completely unaware that his carefully controlled world was about to shatter. For 6 years, she had been the perfect wife, the elegant accessory, the silent partner in his empire. But silence had a price, and Vivian had finally run out of currency to pay it with. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and stick with me until the end, because what happens next will change everything. The clock in the hallway struck 11, each chime echoing through the vast emptiness of the Viscari estate like a countdown. Vivian stood at the bedroom window, watching the security lights sweep across the manicured lawn in methodical patterns. Everything about this place operated on Roman's schedule, Roman's orders, Roman's vision of perfection. Even the roses in the garden bloomed when he demanded it. She had stopped being a person here 3 years ago, maybe 4. It was hard to pinpoint the exact moment when she'd transformed from wife to fixture, from partner to prop. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass. A woman of 32 who looked simultaneously younger and infinitely older than her years. The Valentino dress she wore cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and it fit perfectly because Roman employed a personal stylist who knew her measurements better than she did. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant twist. Her makeup was flawless. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to be. Mrs. Roman Viscari, the enviable wife of one of the most powerful men in the city. The woman in the reflection was a beautiful lie. Vivian turned away from the window and surveyed the bedroom one last time. 1,600 square feet of pristine luxury, all cream silk and polished mahogany, with a sitting area she never used and a fireplace that had never been lit. The bed itself was a California king, vast enough that she and Roman could sleep in it together without ever touching. Which they did, night after night, 2 strangers sharing expensive sheets. The suitcases waited by the door like silent conspirators. She'd packed them that afternoon while Roman was in back-to-back meetings, moving through the closet with surgical precision. Not too much. She didn't want to alert the housekeeper, Maria, who reported everything to Roman whether she meant to or not. Just enough. 3 changes of clothes, toiletries, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her mother, and the envelope of cash she'd been slowly accumulating for the past 2 months. $11,000. It had taken her that long to gather it, selling off small items Roman would never notice. A bracelet he'd given her for an anniversary he'd forgotten to acknowledge, a pair of earrings from a boutique closing sale, a vintage clutch she'd received at some charity gala. Each sale had required careful planning. She couldn't use her credit cards. Roman's assistant reviewed all the statements. She couldn't access their joint accounts without leaving a digital trail. So she'd become resourceful in ways her younger self would never have imagined. The old Vivian, the girl who'd fallen in love with Roman Viscari 7 years ago, would have been horrified at the woman she'd become. That Vivian had been 25, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in art history and dreams of opening her own gallery. She'd been vibrant, optimistic, full of ideas about beauty and meaning and human connection. Roman had seemed like a dream himself back then. Brilliant, ambitious, devastatingly handsome. He'd walked into the small gallery where she worked part-time, looking for a piece for his new office, and their eyes had met across a room full of contemporary sculpture. The chemistry had been immediate, undeniable. He'd asked her to dinner that same night. For 6 months, he'd courted her with an intensity that left her breathless. Flowers arrived at the gallery daily. He'd shown up at her apartment with takeout from her favorite Thai place, content to eat on her ratty couch and listen to her talk about the artists she admired. He'd been attentive, curious, present in a way that made her feel like the most important person in his universe. When he'd proposed, a month after she'd met his family at an elaborate dinner party, she'd said yes without hesitation. Why wouldn't she? He was successful, intelligent, passionate about his work. He came from old money, but had built something entirely his own, a real estate and investment empire that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. And he loved her. She'd been sure of it. The wedding had been a spectacle. 300 guests, a ceremony at the cathedral, a reception at the city's most exclusive hotel. Vivian's mother had cried with joy. Her father, usually stoic, had told her he was proud. She'd floated through it all in a custom gown that cost more than her college tuition, feeling like a princess in a fairy tale. The honeymoon in Santorini had been perfect. 2 weeks of crystalline water, whitewashed villas, and Roman's undivided attention. He'd made love to her like she was precious, irreplaceable. He'd talked about their future, the family they'd build, the life they'd create together. She'd fallen asleep each night in his arms, certain she was the luckiest woman alive. The cracks had started small. They'd returned from Greece to the reality of Roman's schedule. Meetings that ran until midnight, business dinners 3 nights a week. Weekend trips to oversee property developments in other cities. At first, Vivian had understood. He was building something important. She'd kept herself busy decorating their new penthouse, reconnecting with friends, volunteering at a local arts nonprofit. But Roman's absences had grown longer, more frequent. When he was home, he was distracted, his phone constantly buzzing with messages that required immediate attention. Their conversations had become transactional, logistics about social events, questions about household matters, brief exchanges about nothing that mattered. The shift had been gradual enough that Vivian hadn't recognized it as a shift at all. Not at first. She told herself it was normal, that all marriages went through adjustment periods. She'd tried to be understanding, supportive. She'd learned to smile through the dinners where Roman talked business with other men and barely acknowledged her presence. She'd stopped mentioning the gallery opening she wanted to attend when he canceled on her the 3rd time, claiming an unavoidable conflict. 18 months into their marriage, Vivian had realized she was lonely. Not the fleeting loneliness of missing someone who was temporarily away, but the deep, aching loneliness of being invisible to the person sleeping beside you. She'd tried to talk to him about it. Once, after a particularly painful dinner party where he'd introduced her to a business associate as my wife without using her name, she'd waited until they were home and asked quietly if they could spend more time together, just the 2 of them. Roman had looked at her with genuine confusion, as if she'd suggested something absurd. "We spend every evening together," he'd said. "We're in the same house," she'd corrected. "That's not the same thing." His expression had shuddered. "I have responsibilities, Vivian. People depend on me. I can't just drop everything because you're feeling neglected." The word had landed like a slap. Neglected. As if her need for connection, for attention, for basic human warmth from her own husband was some sort of character flaw. She'd tried a different approach. She'd made his favorite meals. She'd planned romantic evenings at home. She'd bought expensive lingerie and waited up for him, hoping to recapture some of the passion from their early days. But Roman had come home exhausted, distracted. He'd thanked her for dinner, but barely tasted it. The romantic evenings had ended with him on his laptop, apologizing but explaining that a deal was closing tomorrow and he needed to review documents. The lingerie had stayed hidden in her drawer, unworn and eventually forgotten. The worst part was that Roman wasn't cruel. He didn't yell or demean her. He provided everything she could possibly need materially. The penthouse had become this estate, 12,000 square feet of architectural perfection with staff to manage every detail. Her closet was full of designer clothes. She drove a Mercedes he'd given her for her birthday. On paper, she had everything. She just didn't have him. By their 3rd anniversary, Vivian had stopped trying. The rejection had worn her down, eroded her confidence until she'd started to believe that maybe she was the problem. Maybe she was too needy, too demanding. Maybe successful men like Roman didn't have time for the kind of marriage she'd imagined. Maybe she should be grateful for what she had and stop wanting more. She'd retreated into herself, building a life that ran parallel to Roman's but rarely intersected with it. She'd thrown herself into charity work, serving on boards and organizing fundraisers. She'd taken up painting again, something she hadn't done since college. She'd developed friendships with other women in similar situations, wives of powerful men who'd learned to find fulfillment in everything except their marriages. It had been sustainable, in a miserable sort of way. Until 6 months ago. Vivian walked to her dresser and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out the leather journal she'd discovered buried in Roman's desk. She shouldn't have been in his study. She knew the space was off limits, his private sanctuary where he handled the most sensitive aspects of his business. But she'd been looking for a pen, something simple and innocuous, and the door had been unlocked. The journal had been at the back of a drawer beneath a stack of old contracts. She'd almost missed it. But something about the worn leather cover had caught her eye, and before she could stop herself, she'd opened it. The entries had been dated from before she'd met Roman, written in his precise handwriting. Most of it was mundane, notes about properties he was considering, thoughts on investments, observations about business partners. But toward the middle, the tone had shifted. She left. Not for someone else. For nothing. For herself. She looked me in the eye and said I had given her everything except a reason to stay. I gave her the world, money, security, status, everything a woman could want. And it wasn't enough. She wanted something I couldn't give. She wanted me to be weak. Never again. Never. I will never hand another person that kind of power. Business is clean. Business makes sense. You give value, you receive value. There's no mystery, no guessing, no waking up one day to find everything you thought you knew was a lie. Marcus says I should move on, find someone else, prove to her that I don't need her. But I don't want someone else. I want to not want anyone. I want to never feel this broken again. The entries had continued for weeks, a raw chronicle of pain that had eventually hardened into resolve. Roman had decided to rebuild himself into someone who couldn't be hurt, someone who trusted systems and structures more than emotions, someone who kept everyone, even those closest to him, at a safe distance. Vivian had read every word, feeling sick and sad and angry all at once, because now she understood. Roman hadn't become emotionally unavailable because he didn't care. He'd chosen it deliberately, built walls around himself as protection against a pain he'd decided never to risk again. And she'd paid the price for someone else's betrayal. The woman who'd left him, Elena, based on references scattered through the entries, had taken a piece of Roman with her. But Vivian had given him 6 years of her life trying to love a man who'd already decided love was too dangerous. She'd put the journal back exactly where she'd found it and walked out of the study feeling something she hadn't felt in years: clarity. Understanding Roman's past didn't change her present. It didn't make the loneliness easier or the humiliation of being treated like elegant furniture more bearable. If anything, it made it worse, because now she knew the truth. Roman had chosen this. He'd made a conscious decision to shut down emotionally, and nothing she did would change that unless he decided to change it himself. And he wouldn't. Because from his perspective, his system worked. He had built an empire. He had wealth, power, respect. He had a beautiful wife who managed his social obligations and never made trouble. Why would he want anything different? Vivian had spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions of her carefully constructed life while something fundamental shifted inside her. She'd stood beside Roman at a gala, smiling graciously while he networked, and realized she felt absolutely nothing. No resentment, no hope, no disappointment, just emptiness. That had scared her more than the pain ever had. 2 days later, she'd opened a new bank account at a branch across the city, someplace Roman would never go. She'd used her maiden name, listed her mother's address as her contact information. The teller had asked if she needed checks, and Vivian had said no, cash only. She'd deposited $200, money she'd withdrawn from an ATM in small increments so it wouldn't trigger any alerts. It had been the first concrete step toward a life Roman didn't control, and it had terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. After that, everything had accelerated. She'd started selling her things. She'd researched apartments in other cities, places far enough away that Roman's influence wouldn't reach. She'd contacted a lawyer in Chicago, someone who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and had a reputation for discretion. She'd planned it all with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd once applied to Roman's dinner parties and charity events. Because Vivian had learned something important during 6 years as Mrs. Roman Vescari. Powerful men didn't respond to emotion or pleading. They responded to strategy, to calm competence, to being presented with situations they couldn't talk their way out of. So she would give Roman no warning, no chance to manipulate or control the narrative. She would simply leave. And then, from a safe distance, she would file for divorce and start negotiating the terms of her freedom. Tonight was the night. Everything was ready. She had a car waiting 2 blocks away. She'd arranged it through a friend of a friend, someone who had no connection to Roman's world. She had a train ticket to Philadelphia in her purse, purchased with cash. From Philadelphia, she'd take a bus to Chicago, where she had a short-term rental apartment waiting under her maiden name. All she had to do was walk out the door. Vivian looked at the clock. 11:30. Roman would be in his study for at least another hour, maybe 2. He worked until 1 or 2 in the morning most nights, fueled by expensive scotch and the adrenaline of whatever deal he was closing. She could be gone before he even realized she'd left the bedroom. She picked up her purse, checked one last time that she had everything essential: ID, cash, phone, train ticket. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected to shake, to feel panic or doubt, but instead she felt calm, determined. She reached for the suitcases. Going somewhere? Vivian froze. She turned slowly. Roman stood in the doorway, still wearing the tailored suit he'd put on that morning. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, the only sign that the day had been long. His eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, moved from her face to the suitcases to the purse clutched in her hand. I asked you a question. His voice was controlled, but she heard the edge underneath. Where are you going, Vivian? Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Away, away. He repeated the word like it was foreign, incomprehensible. Away where? Does it matter? Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, that she wasn't backing down immediately. He stepped into the room, and she had to fight the instinct to step back. Roman didn't intimidate through aggression. He intimidated through presence, through the sheer force of being a man who always got what he wanted. You're my wife, he said, each word precise. Yes, it matters. I was your wife, Vivian corrected quietly. For 6 years I was your wife. But somewhere along the way I became something else. A hostess. A manager. A piece of the set you designed for your life. I forgot what it felt like to be an actual person, Roman. And I need to remember before I disappear completely. He stared at her like she was speaking a language he'd never heard before. That's ridiculous. You have everything. I have nothing that matters, she cut him off, and her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Nothing. Vivian. He moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, that expensive scent she used to love. You're being dramatic. If you're unhappy, we can talk about it. Make some changes. But packing suitcases in the middle of the night and sneaking out like some kind of fugitive, that's not how we handle problems. We don't handle problems, she said flatly. We ignore them until they stop existing. But I still exist, Roman, and I can't do this anymore. Can't do what? The frustration in his voice was building. I've given you everything. This house, your car, unlimited accounts, anything you could possibly want. I want you to see me. The words burst out before she could stop them. I want you to know my favorite color, what I'm afraid of, what makes me happy. I want you to ask about my day and actually listen to the answer. I want to matter to you as something other than a logistical component of your perfect life. Roman's jaw tightened. I'm not doing this right now. I have an early meeting tomorrow, and this conversation is, I know about Elena. The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Roman went very still. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Vivian walked to the dresser, pulled out the journal, and held it up. I found this in your study. I know I shouldn't have been in there, and I know I shouldn't have read it. But I did. And now I understand why you are the way you are. Roman's face had gone pale. That was private. I know. I'm sorry. And she was. But it explained so much. You loved her. She left, and you decided to never let anyone that close again. Put that back. His voice was low, dangerous. She broke your heart, so you dismantled it piece by piece and locked the remains away where no one could reach them. Vivian's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. I get it, Roman. I really do. But I can't be collateral damage for your past anymore. You don't know anything about that. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took the journal from her hands, gripping it like it might dissolve. That was years ago. It has nothing to do with us. It has everything to do with us, Vivian said sadly. You married me, but you never let me in. You gave me access to your bank accounts and your house and your name, but never to you. And I tried. For 6 years, I tried to be enough, to love you enough that you'd feel safe letting those walls down. But you don't want that. You want a wife who doesn't ask for more than you're willing to give. That's not fair, isn't it? She gestured around the beautiful, empty room. Name one thing you know about me that you didn't learn from a file or my assistant. One thing I've told you in the last year that you actually remember. Roman opened his mouth, then closed it. That's what I thought, Vivian said quietly. This is about one bad day, Roman insisted, but he sounded less certain now. You had a difficult evening, and now you're overreacting. This isn't about one day, this is about 1,000 days. About 1,000 nights sleeping next to someone who might as well be a stranger. About smiling through dinners where you introduce me as my wife without even using my name. About watching you pour passion and energy and attention into everything except our marriage. I work hard, Roman said, defensive. Everything I do is to provide for us, to build something, to hide, Vivian interrupted. You work hard to hide, to avoid feeling anything real, to maintain control over a life so carefully structured that nothing unexpected or messy or human can get through. The accusation seemed to hit him harder than anything else she'd said. His grip tightened on the journal. You think you know me so well. I don't know you at all, she said, and the sadness in her voice was profound. That's the problem. You won't let me. Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Vivian could hear the clock ticking in the hall, counting down the seconds of a conversation that felt like it was happening in slow motion. Roman set the journal down on the dresser with careful precision. When he looked at her again, his expression was guarded. What do you want me to say, Vivian? I don't want you to say anything, she answered honestly. I want you to feel something, anything. I want you to be angry or sad or scared that I'm leaving. I want some evidence that I exist in your life as more than an obligation. Of course you exist. As what? She challenged. Your wife? Fine. Define what that means to you, Roman. Because from where I'm standing, it means showing up to events looking appropriate and managing household staff and never, ever asking you for emotional labor you're not willing to give. He flinched. Actually flinched. It was the first genuine reaction she'd seen from him all night. I know you're capable of more, Vivian continued, her voice softer now. I saw it in those journal entries. You loved Elena. You were broken when she left. You felt things deeply enough that it changed the entire trajectory of your life. So I know the man I fell in love with is in there somewhere, but I can't keep waiting for him to come back. Elena was different, Roman started, then stopped, realizing too late what he'd admitted. Yes, Vivian agreed quietly. She was. She was the woman you chose to love. I'm just the woman you chose to marry. The distinction landed like a blow. Roman's careful control cracked just for a moment, and she saw something raw flash across his face. That's not true, he said, but without conviction. Isn't it? Vivian picked up the smaller suitcase. When's the last time we had a conversation about anything that mattered? When's the last time you asked me what I wanted out of life? When's the last time you looked at me and saw Vivian instead of Mrs. Vescari, the perfect accessory to your perfect existence? Roman didn't answer. He couldn't, because they both knew the truth. I'm leaving tonight, Vivian said, and her voice was steady despite the tears finally sliding down her cheeks. I'm going to file for divorce. You can have your lawyers contact mine. We'll work out the details like the civilized, emotionally distant people we've become. She moved toward the door, suitcase in hand. Wait. Roman's voice stopped her. She turned back. He stood in the middle of their bedroom, this powerful man who commanded rooms and closed billion-dollar deals, and he looked lost. Genuinely, completely lost. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to do this. What you're asking for. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in years. I know, Vivian said gently, and that's exactly why I have to go. She walked past him, grabbed the second suitcase, and headed for the stairs. Behind her, she heard him follow. Vivian, stop, please. She kept walking. I'm sorry. The words sounded rusty, unpracticed. If I've made you feel invisible, I'm sorry. Just don't do this. Don't leave like this. Vivian reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to face him. He stood on the landing above her, and for once, the physical distance between them perfectly matched the emotional one. You're sorry I feel invisible, she said. Not sorry for making me invisible. There's a difference. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring that she was probably ruining her makeup. You're sorry I'm unhappy. You're sorry this is inconvenient. You might even be sorry to lose me in the abstract, the same way you'd be sorry to lose a capable employee, but you're not sorry enough to actually change, to risk being vulnerable, To let me see the man you were before you decided feelings were weakness. Roman's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: anger, confusion, something that might have been hurt, before settling back into the controlled mask he wore so well. You're being unfair. I'm being honest, Vivian corrected. She shifted the suitcase to her other hand, her arm already aching from the weight. Maybe for the first time in years, I'm actually being honest with you instead of telling you what I think you want to hear. And what is it you think I want to hear? That everything's fine, that I'm grateful, that I don't need anything you're not already giving me. She moved toward the front door, each step feeling both terrifying and liberating. I've been very good at saying those things, Roman. I've been an excellent wife by your definition. Quiet, accommodating, decorative. But I'm done performing. He came down the stairs quickly, his footsteps sharp against the marble. Where will you go? You haven't thought this through. Vivian reached for the door handle. I've thought about nothing else for months. His hand shot out, pressing against the door above her head, keeping it closed. Not grabbing her, not physically restraining her, but blocking her exit nonetheless. She could smell his cologne again, could feel the heat of his body close behind hers. Once, that proximity would have made her heart race with desire. Now it just made her tired. Move your hand, Roman. Not until we talk about this like adults. She turned to face him, her back against the door. His arm was still braced above her, caging her in. Adults communicate. Adults listen. Adults don't wait until their wife is literally walking out the door before they decide a conversation might be worth having. I'm here now, he said, and there was an edge of desperation creeping into his voice that she'd never heard before. I'm listening now. 6 years too late. That's not fair. Stop saying that. The words came out sharper than she intended. Stop telling me what's fair and what's not when you have no idea what I've been living with. You want fair? Fair would be a husband who noticed when I cut my hair. Fair would be someone who asked about my day occasionally. Fair would be literally any acknowledgement that I exist as a person separate from my role in your perfectly orchestrated life. Roman's jaw clenched. I notice things. Really? What color are my eyes, Roman? He blinked, clearly thrown by the question. What kind of... They're brown. They're green, Vivian said quietly. We've been married for 6 years and you don't even know what color my eyes are. Something in his expression shifted, and for a moment she thought she saw actual shame there. But then it was gone, replaced by frustration. That's a trick question. It's dark in here and you're upset and you're trying to... I'm not trying to do anything except leave. She ducked under his arm, putting distance between them. You can tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself about why this is happening. Blame me for being dramatic or ungrateful or whatever makes it easier. But I know the truth, and so do you. Which is that you chose this. Every single day, you chose your walls over your wife. You chose safety over connection. You chose a marriage that looked perfect from the outside and felt dead on the inside. She picked up both suitcases now, ignoring the strain on her arms. I'm not angry anymore, Roman. I'm just done. He stood there, perfectly still, and she could see him thinking. She knew that look. It was the same calculating expression he got during business negotiations, when he was working through angles and strategies, trying to find the leverage point that would get him what he wanted. What will people say? He finally asked. Of all the things he could have said, that might have been the worst. Vivian actually laughed, a short, bitter sound. That's what you're worried about? Your image. I'm worried about a lot of things, Roman shot back, including how this will look. My wife leaving in the middle of the night like I'm some kind of emotionally negligent husband, Vivian supplied. Because that's what you are. But don't worry, I'm not interested in destroying your reputation. I'm just interested in getting out. She moved toward the door again, and this time he didn't try to stop her, but his voice did. I gave you everything, Vivian. Everything I had. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him one last time. He stood in the grand foyer of his perfect house, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, and he looked genuinely baffled that it wasn't enough. I know, she said softly. That's the saddest part. You really believe that. She opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was cool against her tear-stained face, sharp with the scent of the roses Roman paid a fortune to maintain. The driveway stretched out before her like a runway, security lights illuminating her path to freedom. She made it halfway to the gate before she heard the door open behind her. Wait. She didn't stop. Vivian, please, just wait. There was something different in his voice now, something that made her slow her steps despite herself. She turned. Roman stood on the front steps, and in the harsh glow of the security lights, he looked older than she'd ever seen him. The carefully maintained facade had cracked, and what showed through wasn't the polished businessman or the controlled tactician. It was just a man who'd suddenly realized he was about to lose something he hadn't known how to value. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Tell me what you need, and I'll do it." "It doesn't work like that." "Why not?" He came down the steps, moving toward her slowly, like she was a startled animal that might bolt. "I'm good at solving problems. Give me the parameters, tell me what success looks like, and I'll make it happen." Vivian set down the suitcases, her arms grateful for the relief. "You can't fix this like a business deal, Roman. This isn't a negotiation where you make the right offer and get the outcome you want." "Then what is it?" "It's a marriage. Or it was supposed to be." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild night. "It's supposed to be two people who choose each other every day, who see each other, really see each other, and decide that whatever else happens, they're better together than apart." "I choose you," Roman said, and he sounded almost angry about it. "I married you. I've been faithful to you. I've provided—" "Stop," Vivian interrupted. "Just stop. Providing isn't choosing. Fidelity isn't intimacy. You've done the bare minimum required to maintain the structure of a marriage while completely neglecting the actual relationship." "I don't know what else you want from me." The frustration in his voice was raw now, unfiltered. "I work 80 hours a week to build something that will last, to give us security, to make sure we never have to worry about—" "I worry every single day," Vivian cut him off. "I worry that I'm going to wake up 20 years from now and realize I wasted my entire life waiting for you to notice I was here. I worry that I've already forgotten who I am underneath all the performance. I worry that this," she gestured between them, "is all there is. A beautiful house and empty conversations and sleeping next to someone who treats me like a particularly useful stranger." Roman flinched. "That's not how I see you." "Isn't it? When's the last time we had sex, Roman?" She watched him scramble mentally, saw the moment he realized he couldn't remember. 4 months. It's been 4 months, and before that, it was 3. We went almost 7 months once without touching each other, and you didn't even notice. I've been busy. You're always busy. Too busy for me, too busy for us, too busy for anything that requires you to be emotionally present. She felt the tears coming again and didn't try to stop them. "I spent years thinking maybe I wasn't attractive enough, or interesting enough, or good enough to hold your attention. I read books on how to be a better wife. I tried new things in bed on the rare occasions you were available. I bent myself into shapes trying to be whatever you needed. And then I found that journal and realized the truth." "Which is?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "That you never gave me a real chance. You married me, but you kept the important parts of yourself locked away where I couldn't reach them. You decided before we ever started that I wouldn't get access to the man you really are. And I can't compete with the decision you made before you even met me." Roman ran a hand through his hair, destroying the careful styling. He looked lost in a way she'd never seen before, like someone had rearranged his world and he couldn't find his bearings. "Elena destroyed me. I know. She—" He stopped, started again. "She made me believe in something, and then she took it all away. Said I loved my work more than her, said I was incapable of real intimacy. And maybe she was right, because here we are, and you're saying the same things. I'm not Elena," Vivian said gently. "I'm not trying to punish you or prove a point. I'm just trying to survive." "By leaving." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground between them. When he looked up, his eyes were red. "I don't know how to be what you need." "I know that too." Vivian wiped her face with shaking hands. "That's why I have to go. Because you don't know how, and I don't have the strength to teach you. I'm all out of patience and hope, and the ability to pretend this is enough." "What if I learned?" The question came out rough, uncertain. "What if I tried?" "You've had 6 years to try." "I didn't know—" He stopped himself, seemed to reconsider. "No, you're right. You told me. You tried to tell me so many times, and I didn't listen. I didn't want to hear it because it would have required me to change, and change is scary, Vivian finished. I get it. Vulnerability is terrifying, but marriage without vulnerability isn't really marriage. It's just two people coexisting under the same roof, and I can't do that anymore. Roman moved closer, and she could see that he was actually trembling. This man who commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors was shaking like a leaf. I'm asking you not to go. I'm asking for a chance to fix this. Why now? The question came out harder than she intended. Why does it matter now when it didn't matter for 6 years? Because I'm losing you. His voice cracked. Because, for the first time, it's real. You're actually leaving, and He seemed to struggle with the words. I don't want you to go. That's not enough, Vivian said, even though it hurt to say it. Wanting me to stay because you don't want to lose isn't the same as wanting me because you love me. It's not the same as choosing connection over safety. It's just fear of change. Maybe it is, Roman admitted, but it's also the first honest thing I've felt in years, and that has to count for something. Vivian closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her wanted to drop the suitcases and run back into the house and pretend this conversation had never happened. But she'd worked too hard to get here, fought too many battles with herself to turn back now. I need you to understand something, she said quietly. If I stay, and that's a massive if, things can't go back to the way they were. I won't go back to being invisible. I won't smile through another dinner party where you treat me like wallpaper. I won't spend another year sleeping next to someone who doesn't actually see me. I see you now. Because I'm leaving. Because your control is slipping and it scares you. But what about tomorrow, when the crisis has passed? What about next month, when you're back in your routine and I'm just the wife again? What happens when seeing me stops being urgent? Roman didn't have an answer for that, and his silence was telling. Vivian picked up her suitcases again. That's what I thought. Wait, please, just tell me what to do. Give me something concrete, something I can feel, Vivian interrupted. Feel something real. Be scared or angry or devastated. Stop calculating and strategizing and trying to solve me like I'm a problem with your quarterly earnings. Just be human with me for 5 minutes. I am being human. No, you're being Roman Viscari, master negotiator. You're trying to figure out what I need to hear so you can say it and get the result you want. But I don't want pretty words or promises you don't know how to keep. I want you to actually let me in, and you can't do that. He stared at her, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. The part of him that wanted to maintain control fighting with the part that was genuinely afraid. She'd seen him make business decisions under pressure, watched him weigh options and commit to courses of action with complete confidence. But this was different. This required something he'd spent years training himself not to give. I'm scared, he finally said, the words barely audible. I'm terrified. Of losing you. Of what that means. Of what it says about me that I let it get this far. It was the most vulnerable thing she'd ever heard him say. I'm scared too, Vivian admitted. I'm scared of staying and nothing changing. I'm scared of leaving and regretting it. I'm scared that I've already wasted so much time that I can't get back. They stood there in the driveway, two people who'd promised to love each other forever and had somehow ended up as strangers. The night was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the expensive landscaping. Come back inside, Roman said finally. Not forever, just for tonight. Let's talk about this when we're not both exhausted and emotional. Talking won't fix this. Maybe not, but leaving in the middle of the night won't either. He took a step closer. I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know I've failed you in basically every way that matters, but I'm asking anyway. Give me one more night, and if tomorrow you still want to leave, I won't stop you. Vivian wanted to say no. She wanted to stick to her plan, get in the car waiting 2 blocks away, and never look back. But there was something in Roman's face that stopped her. Not the desperation exactly, but the rawness. The absence of his usual armor. One night, she heard herself say, but I'm not unpacking these suitcases, and I'm not sleeping in our bed. I'll take one of the guest rooms. Relief flooded his expression. Okay, yes, whatever you need. She walked past him back toward the house, every instinct screaming that she was making a mistake. But she'd already made so many mistakes in this marriage. What was one more? Inside, the house felt different than it had 20 minutes ago. Or maybe she felt different. She carried her suitcases upstairs to the guest room at the far end of the hall, as far from the master bedroom as she could get while still being under the same roof. Roman followed her but stopped in the doorway. "Can I get you anything? Water? Are you hungry?" "I'm fine." She set the suitcases down and turned to face him. "I mean it, Roman. Tomorrow we have a real conversation, not a negotiation, not you trying to fix things by throwing money at them, an actual, honest conversation about what happens next." "Tomorrow," he agreed. "I promise." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Vivian sank onto the edge of the guest bed. Her whole body was shaking now, adrenaline and fear and exhaustion catching up with her all at once. She'd been so close to freedom, so close to starting over, and she'd let him talk her into staying for one more night. She pulled out her phone and texted the friend who'd arranged the car, canceling for tonight but keeping the option open for tomorrow. Then she texted the lawyer in Chicago, letting her know there might be a delay. Both responses came back quickly, offering support and understanding. Vivian changed into the pajamas she'd packed, washed her face in the guest bathroom, and climbed into bed. The sheets were crisp and impersonal, nothing like the high thread count luxury of the master bedroom. Somehow, that made her feel safer. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion pulled her under within minutes. When she woke, weak sunlight was filtering through the curtains, and someone was knocking softly on the door. She sat up, disoriented, her mind taking a moment to remember where she was and why. "Vivian?" Roman's voice came through the door. "I made coffee. Can I come in?" She checked the clock. 7:30. She'd slept almost 8 hours, her body apparently deciding that unconsciousness was preferable to dealing with reality. "Give me a minute," she called back. She used the bathroom, splashed water on her face, tried to make herself look less like someone who'd cried herself to sleep. When she opened the door, Roman was standing in the hallway holding 2 mugs of coffee. He'd changed into jeans and a simple sweater, looking more casual than she'd seen him in months. "I wasn't sure how you take it anymore," he admitted, holding out both mugs. "One black, one with cream and sugar." "Cream and sugar," she said, taking that mug. The fact that he didn't know felt like proof of everything she'd said last night. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Downstairs, maybe? Or out on the terrace, if you prefer?" "Terrace is fine." They walked downstairs in silence, and Vivian tried not to think about all the times she'd made this same walk while Roman was already gone for the day. The terrace overlooked the back garden, and at this hour the morning light made everything look softer, less imposing. They sat in the wrought iron chairs that cost more than most people's cars, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I didn't sleep," Roman finally said. "I kept thinking about what you said, about Elena, about the journal, about all of it." Vivian wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, grateful for the warmth. And you were right. About most of it, anyway." He set his own mug down, untouched. "I did shut down after she left. I made a conscious decision to never be that vulnerable again. And when I met you, I thought I could have a marriage without that kind of risk. A partnership based on respect and shared goals instead of love," Vivian supplied quietly. "I was going to say instead of need," Roman corrected. "But yeah, love too, I guess." "That's incredibly sad." It felt practical at the time. He looked out over the garden, his profile stark against the morning light. "Elena left because she said I prioritized work over her. So I thought if I found someone who understood that my work was important, who had her own interests and didn't need constant attention, then it would work." "So you picked me because you thought I wouldn't ask for much." "I picked you because you were brilliant and beautiful, and because talking to you made me feel like the world was bigger than boardrooms and balance sheets." He turned to look at her. "I didn't consciously think about the rest until later. Until we were already married and I realized I'd built the same walls with you that I had with everyone else." "Why didn't you tear them down?" "Because I didn't know how. And because on some level they were working. I had a successful company, a beautiful wife, a life that looked exactly the way I wanted it to look." He paused. "I didn't let myself think about how it felt because feeling was dangerous." Vivian sipped her coffee, processing. "Do you love me, Roman?" The question hung in the air between them. She watched him struggle with it, saw the instinct to deflect or retreat, or give her some polished version of an answer that didn't reveal too much. "I don't know," he finally said, and the honesty of it was almost worse than a lie would have been. "I don't know if what I feel is love or just fear of losing something that's mine. I don't know if I'm capable of the kind of love you're talking about. I know I care about you. I know I respect you. I know the idea of you not being here makes me feel like the ground is shifting under my feet. But whether that's love or just attachment to the familiar, I genuinely can't tell. At least he was being honest. That was something. What do you want from me? Vivian asked. Right now, in this moment, what do you actually want? Roman was quiet for a long time. I want you to stay. I want a chance to figure out if I can be the kind of husband you need. I want to try. Trying isn't enough. I know, but it's all I have right now. He looked at her directly, and she could see the exhaustion in his face. I'm not good at this. At being open, at talking about feelings, at any of it. But I'm willing to get help. To see a therapist, do whatever work I need to do. I just need to know if there's any part of you that still wants to try too. Vivian thought about the woman she'd been when she married him. Hopeful, romantic, certain that love could overcome anything. She thought about the woman she'd become over 6 years of slowly disappearing into the role of Mrs. Vescari, and she thought about the woman she wanted to be, the one who'd packed those suitcases and been ready to walk away. I don't know, she said honestly. Part of me wants to believe you. Part of me is still in love with the man I thought you were when we met. But the smart part, the part that's been paying attention for 6 years, knows that people don't change just because they're scared of the consequences. Real change takes work and time and a commitment that goes deeper than fear. So what do we do? Vivian set her coffee cup down on the small glass table between them, the ceramic making a soft clink that seemed too loud in the morning quiet. We set conditions, real ones, not vague promises about trying harder. Roman leaned forward, elbows on his knees, giving her his full attention in a way that felt almost foreign. Okay, what conditions? First, you start therapy. Not couples therapy, not yet. Individual therapy with someone who specializes in emotional intimacy and attachment issues. And you commit to it. Weekly sessions, minimum 6 months, no canceling because of work emergencies. He nodded slowly. I can do that. Second, we establish boundaries around work. I'm not asking you to stop being ambitious or to tank your company, but the 80-hour weeks, the constant phone calls at dinner, the weekend trips you schedule, without even telling me, that stops. You work reasonable hours. You're present when you're home, and you tell me your schedule in advance so I'm not finding out from your assistant that you'll be in Tokyo for a week. That's harder, Roman admitted. There are situations where I have to... Then you figure out how to delegate, Vivian interrupted. You have a senior management team that you pay very well to handle things. Use them. Because if your company can't function without you being available 24/7, then you've built something unsustainable. He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him to stay quiet. Third, Vivian continued, we have weekly check-ins. Every Sunday evening, we sit down together with no phones, no distractions, and we talk about the week that's coming, about how we're feeling, about what's working and what isn't. And you don't get to treat it like a business meeting. You have to actually engage. Okay. Fourth, we start dating again. 1 night a week, minimum, where we do something together. Doesn't have to be fancy or expensive. Could be cooking dinner at home or taking a walk. But it has to be intentional time where we focus on each other. I can do that, Roman said, and he actually sounded like he meant it. And fifth, Vivian said, her voice dropping, you let me see the real you, not the version you present to the world, not the CEO who has everything under control. The person who hurts and hopes and gets scared. Because I can't love someone who won't let me know them, Roman. I just can't. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. That's the hardest one. I know. What if the real me isn't worth knowing? The vulnerability in the question caught her off guard. What if he is? Roman looked up at her and there was something raw in his expression. Elena said I was cold, incapable of real connection. What if she was right? What if I do all this work and go to therapy and try to open up, and we both just end up realizing that I'm exactly what she said I was? Vivian felt an unexpected surge of compassion. For all his power and control, Roman was still carrying wounds that hadn't healed. Elena was hurt and angry when she left. People say cruel things when they're in pain. It doesn't make them true. But she wasn't entirely wrong either, Roman said. I did choose work over her. I did struggle with intimacy. And here we are years later, and I'm making the same mistakes with you. The difference is you're recognizing it now, Vivian pointed out. You're acknowledging there's a problem instead of just blaming me for being unhappy. That's something. It doesn't feel like much. Change never does at the beginning. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, the morning air getting cooler as clouds moved in. Look, I'm not going to pretend this is going to be easy. I'm angry and hurt, and I've spent 6 years building walls of my own. We're both going to have to do the work here. But if you're actually willing to try, then I'm willing to see where it goes. Hope flickered across Roman's face, tentative and uncertain. Does that mean you'll stay? It means I won't leave today, Vivian clarified. It means I'm willing to give this one real shot. But I need you to understand something, Roman. This is it. This is the only chance you get. If 3 months from now we're back to the same patterns, if you're canceling our dates for conference calls and treating therapy like another obligation to check off your list, I'm gone. And next time I won't give you advance warning. I understand. Do you? Because I need you to really hear what I'm saying. I'm not bluffing. I'm not making empty threats to get your attention. I am genuinely prepared to walk away from this marriage if it doesn't fundamentally change. Roman stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace, looking out over the garden. His shoulders were tense, his posture rigid. You know what the worst part is? You're right about all of it. Every single thing you said last night, every criticism, it's all true. And I knew it. On some level, I've always known I was failing you. I just didn't want to deal with it. Why not? Because dealing with it would mean admitting I was wrong. It would mean acknowledging that my whole strategy for life after Elena was flawed. And it would mean risking getting hurt again. He turned back to face her. It's easier to blame work, to tell myself I'm building something important that requires sacrifice. The truth is, I was just hiding. From what? From you. From the possibility that I could love someone again and have them leave anyway. From the fear that maybe I'm not capable of being the kind of partner someone deserves. He shoved his hands in his pockets. I built this empire, created all this success, convinced myself that if I was powerful enough and accomplished enough, it would be sufficient. But you're right. I gave you everything except what actually mattered. Vivian stood up and walked over to where he was standing. Do you want to know what I needed? Tell me. I needed you to remember that I take my coffee with cream and sugar. I needed you to notice when I changed my hair or wore a new dress. I needed you to ask about my painting, to show interest in the things I care about. I needed you to touch me without it being transactional or scheduled. Her voice caught. I needed to feel like I mattered to you as much as a board meeting or a property acquisition. I'm sorry, Roman said, and this time the apology sounded genuine. I'm sorry for making you feel like you didn't matter, for treating you like part of the scenery, for being so focused on maintaining control that I lost sight of what I was controlling for. It wasn't enough to fix 6 years of neglect, but it was a start. They stood there in silence for a while, the morning settling around them. Vivian could hear birds in the garden, could smell the roses and jasmine that the landscapers maintained with military precision. In all the time she'd lived here, she'd never really noticed these small details. She'd been too busy being miserable. I made an appointment, Roman said suddenly. What? With a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen. She's supposed to be one of the best in the city for attachment and intimacy issues. My first session is tomorrow at 2. Vivian stared at him. You already made an appointment? When? Last night, after you went to the guest room. I couldn't sleep, so I started researching. Found her practice, read reviews, called, and left a message. She called back at 6 this morning and had a cancellation for tomorrow. He looked almost embarrassed. I know it's fast, but I didn't want you to think I was just saying what you wanted to hear. Something in Vivian's chest loosened slightly. That's good. That's a good first step. I also cleared my schedule for the next 2 weeks, delegated 3 major projects to my team, postponed a trip to London, canceled all evening events, and He pulled out his phone and showed her his calendar, which was indeed mostly empty. I know you said reasonable hours, but I figured for the first couple of weeks I should go further, prove that I'm serious. Roman, and I talked to Marcus about covering more of the day-to-day operations. He's been my COO for 8 years. He's more than capable. I've just been controlling about letting go. He was talking faster now, like he was afraid if he stopped he'd lose momentum. I can't promise I'll never have to work late or take an emergency call, but I can promise it won't be the default anymore. Vivian didn't know what to say. This was more action than she'd seen from him in years, all crammed into the 12 hours since she'd tried to leave. Part of her was encouraged. Part of her worried it was just panic-driven behavior that would fade once the immediate crisis passed. "That's a lot of change very quickly," she said carefully. "I know. But you were right. I've had 6 years to make small adjustments, and I didn't. So now I'm making big ones." He put his phone away. "I'm trying, Vivian. I know that's not enough on its own, but I need you to see that I'm actually trying." "I see it." And she did. Whether it would last was another question entirely. They went inside as the morning wore on, and Vivian felt the strangeness of being in this house with Roman actually present. Usually by this time, he'd have been gone for hours, locked in his downtown office orchestrating deals. Instead, he made them breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, but he made it himself rather than having Maria do it. "I didn't know you could cook," Vivian said, watching him move around the kitchen with unexpected competence. "I can't, really. Eggs and toast are about the limit of my abilities." He plated the food and brought it to the breakfast nook. "When I was building the company in the early days, before I had money for takeout every meal, I lived on scrambled eggs. It's one of the few things I never forgot how to make." They ate in comfortable silence, and Vivian tried to remember the last time they'd had breakfast together. Months, at least. Maybe longer. "Tell me about your painting," Roman said suddenly. She looked up, surprised. "What about it?" "You mentioned it last night, that you'd started painting again. I didn't know that." "I started about 2 years ago," Vivian said. "I set up a studio in the East Wing, in that room with the good light that we never used for anything." "What do you paint?" "Landscapes, mostly. Abstract interpretations of places I've been or want to go." She hesitated, then added, "I had a piece accepted into a group show last year, at the Meridian Gallery downtown." Roman's eyes widened. "You did? That's incredible. Why didn't you tell me?" "I did tell you," Vivian said quietly. "The night of the opening, but you had a dinner meeting with investors from Singapore. And when you came home, I mentioned it, and you said, 'That's nice,' and then took a call from your attorney that lasted an hour." She watched the realization hit him, saw him mentally rewind to that night and understand what he'd missed. "I'm sorry, I should have canceled the dinner, been there with you. It's done now. Can I see them, your paintings?" Vivian studied his face, looking for signs that he was just going through motions, but he seemed genuinely interested. "Okay, they're upstairs." She led him to the East Wing studio, a space she'd claimed for herself because Roman never went to this part of the house. The light was indeed perfect, floor-to-ceiling windows facing north, flooding the room with consistent, changeless illumination. Her canvases were propped against the walls, some finished, some still in progress. Roman walked slowly around the room, examining each piece. She watched him take in the bold colors, the emotional intensity she'd poured onto canvas because she had nowhere else to put it. There was a series of ocean scenes, all turbulent water and stormy skies. A collection of architectural studies that were really about emptiness and space. A single portrait that was just colors and shapes, but somehow conveyed profound loneliness. "These are beautiful," Roman said, and he sounded genuinely moved. "Vivian, these are really beautiful. Thank you." "This one," he stopped in front of the portrait. "It feels sad." "It is sad," she confirmed. "I painted it about a year ago, on our anniversary, actually." Roman turned to look at her, understanding dawning. "The one I forgot." "You didn't forget. You sent flowers to the house with a card signed by your assistant, and then you worked until midnight." The memory still stung, but it felt more distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. "I'm an asshole." "You were absent," Vivian corrected. "There's a difference." He looked back at the painting. "How many times did I do this? How many important moments did I miss because I was too focused on work that probably wasn't even that urgent?" "A lot," Vivian said honestly. "But we can't change the past. We can only decide what happens next." Roman turned away from the paintings and faced her directly. "I want to buy your work. Not because you're my wife, but because it's genuinely good, and I want to support what you're doing. Would you let me sponsor a solo show? We could rent a proper gallery, hire a curator." "No," Vivian interrupted. "No, Roman. I appreciate the offer, but that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. You can't fix this by throwing money at it. If I have a solo show, it'll be because I earned it through my own work and connections, not because my wealthy husband bought me one. He looked frustrated. I'm trying to be supportive, I know, but support doesn't mean taking over. It means showing up to my openings, asking about my work, being genuinely interested in what I'm creating. It means letting me build my own career on my own terms. She softened her tone. When I have my next show, and I will eventually, you can be supportive by being there, by actually seeing the work instead of sending flowers and a card. I can do that, Roman said. I want to do that. They left the studio and spent the rest of the morning in an awkward dance of trying to coexist. Roman kept looking at her like he expected her to disappear, and Vivian kept reminding herself not to read too much into one morning of good behavior. Around noon, her phone rang. It was her mother. "Sweetheart, I just wanted to check in," her mother said, her voice warm and concerned. "You seemed a bit off at lunch last week. Is everything all right?" Vivian glanced at Roman, who was pretending to read the newspaper but was obviously listening. "Everything's fine, Mom. Just tired." "Are you sure? Because you know you can talk to me about anything. If something's wrong with Roman or the marriage, it's complicated," Vivian admitted. "But we're working on it." "Working on what?" "Honey, what's going on?" Vivian walked out onto the terrace for privacy. "Roman and I are having some problems, but we're trying to fix them. I can't really talk about it right now." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Do you need me to come over? Your father and I could drive up today if you need support." "No, it's okay. Really. We just need to figure some things out." Vivian appreciated her mother's concern, but the last thing she needed was her parents getting involved. "I'll call you in a few days, okay? When things are more settled." "All right, but Vivian, don't stay in something that makes you miserable just because it looks good from the outside. You deserve to be happy." The words hit harder than her mother probably intended. "I know, Mom. I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart." When Vivian came back inside, Roman was no longer pretending to read. "Your mother thinks I'm making you miserable." "My mother doesn't know anything specific. She just has good instincts." "She's not wrong, though," Roman said. "I have been making you miserable." "We've been making each other miserable," Vivian corrected. "This isn't all on you, Roman. I stayed silent for years instead of fighting harder for what I needed. I let myself disappear instead of demanding to be seen. We both made mistakes. But I made the bigger ones." She couldn't really argue with that. The afternoon stretched out uncomfortably. They were both trying too hard, too aware of each other, neither knowing quite how to act. Vivian caught herself multiple times starting to retreat to her usual activities. The charity work, the painting, the careful construction of a life that didn't require Roman's participation. But that was the old pattern, and if they were going to change, she had to be willing to be uncomfortable for a while. Around 4, Roman's phone buzzed. He looked at it, then silenced it without answering. "You can take that if it's important," Vivian said. "It's not important. It's Marcus asking about the London trip I postponed. He can handle it." Roman set the phone face down on the counter. "I meant what I said about changing my work habits." "It's only been 1 day." "I know, but it's a start." That evening, they ordered takeout, Thai food from the place Roman used to bring to her apartment in the early days. Vivian was surprised he remembered it existed. "I called them," Roman admitted when she mentioned it. "Asked if they still had the same menu. You always used to get the massaman curry with extra peanuts and the spring rolls." "You remember that?" "I remember more than you think," he said quietly. "I just got very good at not showing it." They ate on the terrace, watching the sun set over the garden. It wasn't romantic exactly. There was too much tension, too much history between them for that. But it was peaceful, almost normal. "What happens tomorrow?" Vivian asked as they cleared the plates. "I have therapy at 2, Roman said. "Other than that, my day is open. What do you want to do?" The question itself was revolutionary. "I don't know. I haven't had you ask that in years." "Well, I'm asking now." Vivian thought about it. "I want to go into the city, walk around the art district, maybe visit a few galleries. Just spend the day being normal people instead of Mr. and Mrs. Vescari." "Okay," Roman said. "We can do that." "You won't be bored?" "Probably a little," he admitted with unexpected honesty. "But I can handle being bored for an afternoon, and maybe I'll learn something about what you care about." That night, Vivian returned to the guest room. Roman looked disappointed, but didn't argue. "How long until we share a room again?" he asked from the doorway. "I don't know," Vivian said honestly. "When it feels right. When I trust that this is real and not just panic about me leaving." Fair enough. He left, and Vivian climbed into bed feeling exhausted but less hopeless than she had 24 hours ago. She still wasn't sure this would work. She still had her suitcases packed, still had the lawyer's number in her phone, still had one foot out the door. But she was staying. For now, she was staying. The next morning, they drove into the city together. Roman insisted on driving instead of having their usual driver, and Vivian found herself oddly charmed by the normalcy of it. In the car, Roman seemed more relaxed, less like he was performing the role of attentive husband, and more like he was actually present. "Tell me about the galleries we're visiting," he said as they navigated traffic. "There's a group show at the Chelsea Contemporary that I've been wanting to see, and the Morrison Gallery is featuring a new artist whose work I've been following online. Then I thought we could walk through the sculpture park if the weather holds." "Sounds good. Do we need tickets or anything?" "No, we can just walk in." They spent the morning moving through galleries, and Vivian watched Roman actually engage with the art. He asked questions, wanted to know what she thought of different pieces, listened when she explained techniques or historical context. It felt surreal having his full attention like this. At lunch, they found a small cafe tucked between two galleries. Nothing fancy, just sandwiches and coffee. Roman ordered without checking his phone, without glancing at his watch every few minutes. "How are you doing with the phone withdrawal?" Vivian asked. He smiled ruefully. "It's harder than I expected. I keep reaching for it out of habit, but I'm managing." "You can check it if you need to." "I don't need to. Marcus has explicit instructions to only contact me for genuine emergencies. Everything else can wait." He took a bite of his sandwich. "This is nice. Being out with you like this? I'd forgotten what it felt like. We used to do this all the time when we were dating." "I know. I don't know why I stopped." "You got busy," Vivian said. "And I got accommodating. We fell into patterns that were easier than actually connecting." "I want to break those patterns," Roman said. "I know I keep saying it, but I mean it. I don't want to go back to the way things were." "Words are easy, Roman. It's the sustained action that's hard." "I know." They finished lunch and continued their gallery tour. Around 1:30, Roman checked his watch. "I should head to my therapy appointment," he said. "Do you want me to drop you home first?" "I can take a cab," Vivian said. "Or just keep exploring and meet you back at the house later." "You sure?" "Yeah, go do your therapy. I'll be fine." He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, then just nodded. "Okay, I'll see you later then." Vivian watched him walk to the car and felt a strange mix of hope and apprehension. He was going to therapy. He was actually doing the work she'd asked him to do. But was it enough? And more importantly, would it last? She spent the afternoon alone, visiting a few more galleries and thinking about everything that had happened in the past 2 days. The woman who'd packed those suitcases felt like a different person already. Braver, maybe. More certain of what she deserved. When she got home around 5, Roman's car was in the driveway. She found him in the kitchen, staring at his laptop, but not really seeing it. "How was therapy?" she asked. He looked up, and she could see that whatever had happened in that session had affected him. "Intense. Dr. Chen doesn't pull punches." "What did you talk about?" "Elena mostly, and my parents, and how I learned to equate emotional vulnerability with weakness." He closed the laptop. "She gave me homework. I have to journal every day about my feelings and bring it to next week's session." "Roman Vescari, keeping a feelings journal," Vivian said, and despite everything she smiled. "That's something I never thought I'd see." "Yeah, well, apparently I have a lot of unpacking to do." He stood up and walked over to where she was standing. She also said, "I need to be patient with myself, that changing patterns that are decades old won't happen overnight." She's right. But she also said that's not an excuse for not trying, that being patient with myself doesn't mean being complacent. They stood there in the kitchen, close but not touching, and Vivian felt the weight of possibility between them. This could work. It might actually work. Or it could fall apart spectacularly. But at least they were trying. "I have something for you," Roman said suddenly. He went to his briefcase and pulled out a small wrapped package. "It's not much, just something I saw on the way home from therapy." Vivian opened it carefully. Inside was a beautiful leather journal, the kind artists used for sketching and notes. For your painting ideas, Roman explained, Dr. Chen was talking about the importance of creative expression, and I thought of you and your studio. I know it's not a big gesture, but I wanted you to know I was thinking about your work, about what matters to you. It was such a small thing, but somehow it meant more than any of the expensive jewelry he'd ever given her. Thank you, Vivian said softly. Really, thank you. That small journal became something Vivian carried with her everywhere over the next few weeks. She sketched ideas for paintings during breakfast, jotted down color combinations while waiting for coffee, documented the small shifts happening in her marriage with a detail that surprised her. Because things were shifting, slowly and unevenly, like tectonic plates finding new positions after an earthquake. Roman went to therapy every Tuesday at 2. He never missed an appointment, even when a crucial deal was closing and Marcus called him 3 times in an hour. Vivian could hear him on the phone sometimes, his voice firm as he redirected his COO to handle things without him. The first few times he'd looked physically pained making those calls. By the 3rd week, it seemed easier. The Sunday check-ins became a ritual. Every Sunday at 7, they sat in the living room with no phones, no television, nothing but coffee and each other. The first one had been awkward, stilted, both of them unused to structured vulnerability. Roman had read from his therapy journal, his voice halting as he shared insights Dr. Chen had pushed him toward. Vivian had talked about her fear that this was temporary, that he'd eventually revert to old patterns once the crisis of her almost leaving faded. I'm scared of that too, Roman had admitted. Dr. Chen says the fear is actually useful. It means I'm taking this seriously. By the 4th Sunday check-in, they developed a rhythm. Roman talked about what was coming up at work, but he also talked about how he was feeling about it. The stress, the excitement, the moments when he caught himself falling into old patterns of using work to avoid emotional discomfort. Vivian shared her frustrations and hopes, the ways she was learning to speak up instead of retreating into silence. The weekly dates were harder to navigate. The first one, Roman had made reservations at the most expensive restaurant in the city, pulling strings to get a table that was booked months in advance. Vivian had looked at the confirmation on his phone and shook her head. This isn't what I meant, she'd said, but it's supposed to be the best. I don't want the best, Roman. I want real. I want to go somewhere we can actually talk without feeling like we're performing for other people. She'd pulled out her own phone and found a small Italian place in their neighborhood. Here, this place has good reviews and it's quiet. They'd gone to the Italian restaurant, sat in a corner booth, and had their first real date in years. No business associates stopping by the table. No photographers from society pages. Just 2 people eating pasta and trying to remember how to talk to each other about things that mattered. Tell me something I don't know about you, Roman had said over tiramisu. Vivian had thought about it. I'm thinking about going back to school, getting my master's in fine arts. His eyebrows had risen. Really? When did you decide that? I've been thinking about it for a year, but I never mentioned it because I figured you'd just dismiss it or tell me I didn't need a degree to paint. Would I have said that? Probably. The old you would have. She'd taken a bite of the dessert. Would the new you? Roman had been quiet, considering. The new me, or the me I'm trying to be, would ask if it's what you really want. And if you said yes, I'd ask how I could support you. And if supporting me meant your wife going back to being a student, meant less time for charity boards and hosting dinners and all the things Mrs. Vescari is supposed to do, then we'd figure it out, he'd said. Apply to programs, see what happens. I'm serious, Vivian. If this is what you want, then do it. She'd applied to 3 programs the next week, 2 in the city, 1 in Philadelphia. She hadn't told Roman about the Philadelphia one. That was her backup plan, her exit strategy if this all fell apart. She wasn't quite ready to fully trust yet, but trust was building inch by painful inch. Like the morning in week 5 when Vivian had come downstairs to find Roman making breakfast again. Still just eggs and toast, his culinary skills hadn't expanded. And he'd greeted her with a kiss on the forehead before handing her coffee. It was such a small gesture, but it had made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Or the evening she'd found him in her studio, standing in front of her paintings, with his therapy journal open, writing something. She'd watched from the doorway, unsure if she should interrupt. Dr. Chen asked me to spend time with things that make me feel something, he'd said without turning around. Your work makes me feel a lot of things. Sadness, mostly. Because I can see your loneliness in every brushstroke, and I put it there. Roman, I'm not looking for reassurance, he'd interrupted, finally turning to face her. I'm just acknowledging the truth. You poured your pain into these, and I was too disconnected to even notice you were in pain. That's on me. The physical intimacy was coming back too, but slowly. They'd graduated from separate rooms to sharing the master bedroom again in week 3, though they'd slept on opposite sides of the massive bed with careful distance between them. The first time Roman had reached for her, tentative, uncertain, Vivian had frozen. I'm sorry, he'd said immediately, pulling back. Too fast, I shouldn't have. No, it's okay. She had taken his hand, laced her fingers through his. I'm just not ready for more than this yet. Holding hands is good, Roman had said quietly. Holding hands is a start. 2 weeks later, they'd made love for the first time in 5 months. It hadn't been the passionate reunion of romantic movies. It had been awkward and emotional and healing in a way that perfect sex never could be. Afterward, Vivian had cried and Roman had held her, and neither of them had tried to explain what it meant, but it wasn't all smooth progress and meaningful breakthroughs. There were setbacks, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves like muscle memory. Like the morning Roman had woken up at 5 and been on a conference call by 5:30, his voice carrying through the house as he tore into someone over projected earnings. Vivian had found him in his study at 7, still on calls, with 3 more scheduled before 9. What happened to reasonable hours? She'd asked from the doorway. He'd looked up, startled and guilty. There's a crisis with the Shanghai office. I need to. You have a COO who handles international operations. Call Marcus. Marcus is in Seattle for his daughter's college graduation. I can't. Then call David or Jennifer or any of the other highly paid executives whose entire job is to handle this kind of thing. Vivian had crossed her arms. You promised, Roman. I know, but this is different. This is urgent. Everything is urgent to you. That's the problem. She'd turned to leave, disappointed and angry with herself for being disappointed. She should have expected this. Wait. Roman had ended his call mid-sentence, leaving someone sputtering on the other end. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm doing it again. Yes, you are. He'd sat there, clearly torn between the demands of work and the demands of their agreement. Vivian had watched the internal battle play out across his face. Finally, he'd picked up his phone and called his CFO. David, I need you to handle the Shanghai situation. I know it's early, but this is your area and you've been briefed on all the details. He'd listened to whatever protest came through. I understand it's complicated. That's why I hired people I trust to handle complicated things. I'm available if you truly need me, but otherwise, this is yours. Send me updates, but make the calls yourself. He'd ended the call and looked at Vivian. Better? It's a start, but you can't keep doing this, Roman. You can't keep treating every work problem like it's a crisis that only you can solve. That's not delegation. That's just control with extra steps. I know. He'd rubbed his face, looking tired. It's harder than I thought it would be, letting go. Most worthwhile things are hard. There had been other rough moments. A dinner party they'd agreed to host where Roman had slipped back into treating Vivian like the perfect hostess instead of his partner. She'd called him on it the next morning during their check-in, and he'd been defensive at first before catching himself. You're right, he'd said. I introduced you as my wife who organized this beautiful evening instead of by your name. I didn't even realize I was doing it. That's the problem. These behaviors are so ingrained that you don't notice them. And I'm trying not to police every little thing you say, but it hurts, Roman. It still hurts when you make me invisible. I'm sorry. I'll do better. And mostly, he did. But better wasn't the same as fixed, and Vivian was learning to accept that maybe it never would be. Maybe marriage wasn't about reaching some perfect end state where all problems were solved. Maybe it was about 2 imperfect people choosing to keep showing up, keep trying, keep being honest even when it was uncomfortable. The real test came in week 7, when Roman's biggest competitor made an aggressive move to acquire one of his key properties. It was the kind of situation that would normally have consumed him completely. 18-hour days, weekend war rooms, every ounce of his focus on crushing the threat. Marcus had called on a Tuesday morning, his voice tense with urgency. We need you in the office, now. Hartwell just filed papers to challenge our bid on the Brooklyn development. If we don't respond fast, we could lose the whole project. Vivian had watched Roman's face as he listened, saw the old instincts kick in. His shoulders had squared, his jaw had set, his whole body had gone into battle mode. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he'd said. "Roman," Vivian had started, "I have to handle this. This project is worth $200 million. If Hartwell takes it, it undermines our entire East Coast expansion strategy. I know it's important, but you have therapy at 2. I'll reschedule. You promised you wouldn't cancel for work emergencies." "This isn't just a work emergency, Vivian. This is someone actively trying to destroy something I've built. I can't just let Marcus handle it." They'd stared at each other across the kitchen, and Vivian had felt something cold settle in her stomach. Here it was, the moment where Roman had to choose between his old life and the new one they were trying to build, and she could see him calculating, weighing, trying to find a way to do both. "Go to work," she'd said quietly. "Handle your crisis. But if you cancel therapy, we're done. I mean it, Roman. This is the line." He'd looked at her like she'd slapped him. "You're going to end our marriage over one missed appointment?" "No. I'm going to end our marriage over you proving that when it really matters, work will always come first. You've been making progress for 7 weeks, but if the first time you face a real challenge, you abandon the commitments you made to our relationship, then I know where I stand, and I'm not interested in standing there anymore." Roman had grabbed his keys, his phone, his briefcase. At the door, he'd turned back. "This isn't fair. You're asking me to choose between my company and you." "I'm asking you to keep your word," Vivian had corrected. "You said therapy was non-negotiable. You said you were committed to changing. Now you get to prove whether you meant it or whether it was just something you said to keep me from leaving." He'd left without another word, and Vivian had spent the rest of the morning trying not to think about whether she'd see him at 2 o'clock or whether she'd be packing her suitcases again. At 1:30, she'd gotten a text. "In meeting with Hartwell's team, going to run long, still planning to make therapy." At 1:50, another text. "Leaving office now. We'll be late, but I'm coming." Roman had walked into Dr. Chen's office at 2:15, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled from a day of stress. Vivian had been sitting in the waiting room, unsure whether to be angry that he was late or relieved that he'd shown up at all. "I'm here," he'd said. "I told Marcus to handle the rest. I'm here." That session had been brutal. Dr. Chen had pushed Roman hard on why he'd almost canceled, what the Brooklyn property meant to him, why he equated his professional success with his personal worth. He'd talked about his father, about growing up in a family where accomplishments were the only currency that mattered, where showing weakness or putting personal needs first was seen as failure. "My father built an empire," Roman had said, his voice tight. "And then he lost it all because he got sick and couldn't keep fighting. When he died, we had nothing. I was 15, and I watched my mother have to ask relatives for money to pay for his funeral. I swore I would never be that vulnerable, that I would build something so strong that nothing could take it away." "But that's not actually possible," Dr. Chen had said gently. "You can't control everything, Roman. You can't make yourself invulnerable to loss or pain or uncertainty. And trying to do so is costing you the relationship you say you want to preserve." "I know that intellectually," Roman had said, "but knowing it and feeling it are different things." After the session, they'd sat in the car in silence for a long time. "I almost didn't come," Roman had finally admitted. "I was in that meeting, and Hartwell's attorney was being aggressive, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay and fight, to prove that nobody takes what's mine. But you came anyway. Because you matter more than a building, even a $200 million building." He'd looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend that was easy. It wasn't. My whole body was telling me I was making a mistake. But I did it anyway." "What happened with Hartwell?" "Marcus is handling it. He called David and Jennifer in. They're working on a counter strategy. I'll get briefed tonight, but they're capable of managing this without me hovering." He'd started the car. "Dr. Chen says I need to learn to tolerate the discomfort of not being in control. Apparently today was practice." That night, Roman's team had successfully blocked Hartwell's bid and secured the Brooklyn property with a strategy that Marcus had developed. When Roman had gotten the news, Vivian had watched complex emotions play across his face. Relief, certainly, but also something that looked like surprise. "They didn't need me," he'd said, almost to himself. "They actually didn't need me at all. Is that a bad thing? I don't know. I've spent 20 years making myself indispensable. Turns out, I'm not. He'd poured himself a scotch, then poured it down the sink instead of drinking it. Dr. Chen would probably say that's growth. The weeks continued to pass. Vivian got acceptance letters from 2 of the 3 MFA programs, both local ones. The Philadelphia program sent a rejection, which felt like the universe telling her she wouldn't need an escape route after all. She enrolled in the program at the city's Institute of Fine Arts, starting in the fall semester. Roman had taken her out to celebrate, to the same small Italian place that had become their default date spot. Over wine and pasta, he'd toasted her acceptance. To my wife, the graduate student, he'd said, clinking his glass against hers. I'm proud of you. Thank you for not making this weird. Why would I make it weird? Because Mrs. Roman Vescari going back to school doesn't exactly fit the image you've cultivated. The other wives don't have careers. They have charity work and decorating projects. Roman had frowned. I don't care about other wives. I care about you being happy. And if going back to school makes you happy, then that's what matters. It was a small statement, but it represented a massive shift from the man who'd once introduced her at parties without using her name. They developed new routines. Saturday mornings became farmers' market days, where they'd wander through stalls picking out vegetables and fresh bread, arguing good-naturedly about whether they needed another jar of local honey. Roman had never grocery shopped before. He'd had staff for that, but he threw himself into it with unexpected enthusiasm. This tomato is perfect, he'd said one morning, holding up a misshapen heirloom variety. Look at the color. Vivian had laughed. 2 months ago, you couldn't tell me what color my eyes were. Now you're critiquing produce. I'm a fast learner. He'd kissed her cheek, right there in the middle of the market, not caring who saw. And for the record, your eyes are green. Green with little gold flecks that show up in bright sunlight. Those were the moments that made Vivian think this might actually work. When Roman was just Roman, not the CEO or the businessman or the carefully controlled image he'd spent years crafting, when he was just a man trying to be better for the woman he loved, because he did love her. He'd said it one night in bed, unprompted, not during sex or any charged moment, just said it quietly into the darkness. I love you, Vivian. I know I don't say it enough. I know I didn't show it for a long time, but I do. I love you. She'd been quiet, processing. Then, I love you too. I never stopped, even when I probably should have. I'm glad you didn't stop, Roman had whispered. I'm glad you gave me a chance to figure out what I almost lost. But love wasn't enough on its own. They both knew that now. Love without action was just a feeling, and feelings faded. What mattered was the daily choice to keep showing up, keep being vulnerable, keep doing the hard work of actually seeing each other. In therapy, they'd started couples sessions in addition to Roman's individual work. Dr. Chen had them do an exercise where they each wrote down what they needed from the other person. Not grand gestures or dramatic changes, but small, concrete things. Vivian's list had included, ask me about my painting at least twice a week. Plan our dates yourself instead of leaving it to me. Tell me when you're struggling instead of retreating into work. Look at me when I'm talking instead of scanning your phone. Roman's list had been shorter but equally revealing. Tell me when I'm screwing up instead of going silent. Help me understand when I'm being emotionally distant because I genuinely don't notice. Be patient when I struggle with vulnerability. Keep painting because seeing you create something makes me feel connected to you. They'd committed to those lists, checking in regularly about whether they were meeting each other's needs. It wasn't romantic exactly. It was more like building a structure, laying foundation and framework for something that could actually support the weight of 2 full human beings instead of collapsing under the pressure of unmet expectations. 3 months after the night Vivian had packed her suitcases, they had their first real fight. Not the quiet, resentful disconnection of their old patterns, but an actual, voices-raised, tears-flowing argument. It had started over something stupid. Roman had committed them to a charity gala without asking her first, assuming she'd be available. Vivian had pointed out that he'd promised to check with her before making social commitments. Roman had gotten defensive, saying it was an important event and he'd thought she'd want to go. Vivian had accused him of falling back into old habits. Roman had accused her of looking for reasons to be angry. It had escalated from there, both of them saying things that cut deeper than they'd intended. Roman had thrown out that he was trying so hard and nothing was ever good enough. Vivian had shouted that she'd been trying for 6 years before he'd bothered to notice she existed. Maybe this was a mistake. Roman had said, his voice cold and controlled in a way it hadn't been in months. Maybe we're just fundamentally incompatible, and we should stop pretending otherwise. Vivian had felt like he'd punched her. Fine, if that's what you want, I'll pack my bags, again. That's not what Roman had stopped himself, visibly struggling. I'm angry, and I'm saying things I don't mean. Can we just stop for a minute? Why? So you can shut down emotionally and pretend this didn't happen? No, so we can both calm down and have this conversation like adults, instead of screaming at each other. They'd separated to different parts of the house. Vivian had gone to her studio and thrown paint at a canvas with more violence than artistry. Roman had gone for a drive, coming back an hour later with red eyes that suggested he'd been crying in the car. They'd reconvened in the living room, both exhausted. I'm sorry, Roman had said first. I shouldn't have said we were incompatible. I don't believe that. I was hurt and defensive, and I lashed out. I'm sorry too, Vivian had admitted. I did kind of jump on the gala thing as proof that you haven't changed, when really it was just a scheduling mistake. I'm still waiting for you to revert to the old Roman, and that's not fair to the work you've been doing. It wasn't just a scheduling mistake, though, Roman had said. It was me falling into the old pattern of making decisions without consulting you. You were right to call me on it. They'd talked for hours that night, working through the fight, understanding what had triggered each of them, committing to do better. It had been messy and uncomfortable and ultimately necessary, because they were learning that conflict didn't have to be destructive. It could be productive, a way of showing each other where the boundaries were and what they needed to feel safe. Dr. Chen had been pleased when they'd reported the fight in their next session. Good, she'd said. You fought and the marriage didn't end. You both said hurtful things and then you came back and repaired. That's actually healthy. It didn't feel healthy, Vivian had said. Healthy doesn't always feel good in the moment, but you're building new patterns. Learning to navigate conflict without one person shutting down or the other person leaving, that's real progress. As summer approached, Vivian could feel the shift in their relationship solidifying. It wasn't perfect. They still had bad days, moments where old patterns tried to resurface. But the foundation was stronger now. Roman continued therapy religiously, even when it was uncomfortable. Vivian kept speaking up instead of retreating into silence. They celebrated their 7th anniversary in June. Roman had planned a whole day, a private tour of the Modern Art Museum in the morning, lunch at a rooftop garden, an afternoon picnic in the park. But the gift that had meant the most was the album he'd put together. Inside were photos from throughout their marriage, but each one had a handwritten note from Roman. The wedding photo. I thought I knew what I was promising. I didn't. I'm learning now. A picture from a charity event 3 years in. You wore that blue dress. I never told you how beautiful you looked. I'm sorry. A recent photo from the farmer's market. The moment I realized I was happy, really happy, because of you. Vivian had cried reading through it, and Roman had held her, and they'd both acknowledged how far they'd come and how much further they still had to go. That album sat on Vivian's nightstand for weeks after their anniversary, and she found herself looking through it on the hard days when doubt crept in and whispered that maybe this was all temporary. Because the truth was, trust didn't rebuild overnight, and some part of her was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. It finally did in August, though not in the way she'd expected. Vivian had been in the studio working on a new series of paintings for her graduate portfolio when her phone rang. It was Roman's assistant Claire, which was unusual. Claire never called her directly. Mrs. Vescari, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Mr. Vescari collapsed during a meeting about 20 minutes ago. He's being taken to Metropolitan Hospital right now. The world had tilted sideways. What? What happened? I don't have many details. He seemed fine, and then he just went down. The paramedics think it might be his heart. I'm heading to the hospital now. Vivian had dropped everything and driven to the hospital with her heart hammering so hard she could barely breathe. All the progress they'd made, all the work they'd done, all the careful rebuilding of their marriage, none of it would matter if Roman died. The thought of losing him now, just when they'd found their way back to each other, was unbearable. She'd found Marcus in the emergency room waiting area, looking shaken. He's stable, Marcus had said immediately, seeing the panic on her face. They're running tests, but he's conscious and stable. What happened? We were in a meeting about the quarterly projections. Roman was presenting, and he just stopped mid-sentence, put his hand on his chest, said something about pressure, and then he was on the floor. Marcus had run a hand through his hair, scared the hell out of all of us. A doctor had come out shortly after, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Mrs. Vescari, your husband is asking for you. He's in Bay 4. Vivian had found Roman hooked up to monitors, an IV in his arm, looking pale and younger than she'd ever seen him. When he saw her, relief flooded his face. "Hey," he'd said weakly. "Don't you hey me," Vivian had said, her voice shaking as she took his hand. "You scared me to death." "I'm okay. The doctor says it wasn't a heart attack." "Then what was it?" Before Roman could answer, the doctor had come in with a tablet full of test results. "Mr. Vescari, your heart appears to be fine. What you experienced was a severe panic attack." Roman had stared at her. "That's not possible. I don't have panic attacks." "Well, you had one today. Your symptoms, chest pressure, shortness of breath, dizziness, are all consistent with acute anxiety. Have you been under unusual stress lately?" "No more than usual," Roman had started to say, then stopped. "Actually, maybe more than usual. I've been trying to cut back on work hours, delegate more, and it's been difficult." The doctor had nodded knowingly. Anxiety often manifests physically when we're going through major life changes, even positive ones. Your body has been running on stress hormones for years by the sound of it. When you try to change those patterns, there can be a withdrawal effect of sorts. After the doctor left, Vivian had pulled a chair up to Roman's bedside. "You've been having anxiety and you didn't tell me? I didn't realize that's what it was. I just thought I was stressed about work, about trying to balance everything." He'd looked at her, vulnerable and scared in a way that had nothing to do with his physical health. "What if I can't do this, Vivian? What if I can't be the person you need and still be successful at my job? What if trying to have both is what put me in this hospital bed?" "That's not what put you here," Vivian had said firmly. "What put you here was 20 years of running yourself into the ground without dealing with your emotional health. Your body is telling you to slow down, to actually process what you're feeling instead of pushing through it." Dr. Chen said something similar, that I've been using work as a way to avoid feeling anything uncomfortable. And now that I'm trying to actually feel things, it's overwhelming. They'd kept him overnight for observation. Vivian had stayed, dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair, waking every time a monitor beeped or a nurse came to check vitals. In the early morning hours, she'd watched Roman sleep and thought about how close she'd come to walking away from this. From him. How close she'd been to missing all of this. The hard work and the small victories and the messy, imperfect healing. When Roman was discharged the next day with instructions to follow up with Dr. Chen and consider anti-anxiety medication, Vivian had driven him home and put him to bed despite his protests that he was fine. "You're not fine," she'd said. "You had a panic attack severe enough to send you to the hospital. You're going to rest and we're going to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. I'll manage it." "No, you'll address it. There's a difference." She'd sat on the edge of the bed. "Roman, you can't keep trying to control everything. Your health, your work, your emotions. You can't white-knuckle your way through life anymore. It's literally killing you." He'd been quiet for a long time. "I'm scared that if I let go, everything will fall apart." "Everything already fell apart," Vivian had said gently. "That's what happened with our marriage. You held on so tight to control that you strangled the life out of us. We're rebuilding now, but you have to actually change, not just perform change until you can go back to the way things were." "I am changing." "You're trying to change, but you're also fighting it every step of the way. You go to therapy, but you still see vulnerability as weakness. You delegate at work, but you're anxious every moment you're not in control. You're present with me, but part of you is always calculating how to get back to the safety of emotional distance." She'd taken his hand. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because I love you, and I can see how much this is costing you." Roman's eyes had filled with tears. "I don't know how to be any other way." "Yes, you do. You're already doing it. You're just making it harder than it needs to be by fighting yourself the whole time." She'd squeezed his hand. "What if you stopped treating change like the enemy? What if you actually embraced it instead of white-knuckling through it?" That conversation had marked another turning point. Roman had started medication for anxiety, which he'd initially resisted before Dr. Chen convinced him it wasn't a moral failing to need chemical help rebalancing his brain. He'd also started meditation, which he'd complained about constantly. I'm sitting here trying to empty my mind, and all I can think about is how I'm wasting time that could be spent on actual productive activities, he'd grumbled one morning. The meditation is productive, Vivian had said from across the room where she was sketching. It's teaching you that you don't have to be doing something every second to have value. I know that intellectually. But you don't believe it. You think your worth is tied to your productivity. That's what therapy is for. Unpacking that. Roman had made a face but kept meditating. Small victories. The fall semester started and Vivian threw herself into graduate school with an energy she hadn't felt in years. Roman had driven her to her first day of classes, kissed her goodbye in the parking lot, and told her he was proud of her. It was such a small thing, but it had made her feel seen in a way she desperately needed. Her classmates were mostly younger, fresh out of undergrad or only a few years older. Vivian was one of the older students in the program, and at first she'd felt self-conscious about it. But her professor, a brilliant abstract painter named Judith Reeves, had pulled her aside after the first critique session. "You have something most of these kids don't," Judith had said. "Life experience, pain, real emotional depth. I can see it in your work. Don't hide it. Let it fuel what you create." Vivian had started bringing her work home to show Roman, walking him through her process, explaining her artistic choices. He'd ask questions that showed he was actually paying attention, actually trying to understand what she was creating and why. "This one feels different from the others," he'd said one evening, looking at a piece she'd done in shades of gold and amber. "Less dark. It's about hope," Vivian had explained. "About coming out of a long winter and finding light again." Roman had looked at her, understanding dawning. "Is this about us?" "Everything I paint is about us in some way. Or about me. Or about what we're becoming." She'd stepped back to examine the painting alongside him. "I spent years painting my loneliness. Now I'm trying to paint something else." "What?" "Possibility. The idea that people can actually change if they're willing to do the work." In October, Roman's company faced another crisis. This time, a major investor threatening to pull out over concerns about leadership direction. The old Roman would have gone into full battle mode, worked around the clock, sacrificed everything to save the deal. The new Roman called Marcus, delegated the primary negotiation, and showed up to his therapy appointment on time. "You're not going to personally handle it?" Marcus had asked, sounding surprised. "You're going to handle it," Roman had said. "You know the investor's concerns better than I do at this point. You've been managing that relationship for 3 years. I trust you to find a solution." "But, Marcus, I hired you because you're brilliant. Let yourself be brilliant. I'll be available for consultation, but this is your project." After he'd hung up, Vivian had looked at him with something like awe. "Who are you, and what have you done with my husband? I'm learning that the company won't collapse if I'm not personally involved in every decision, and that if it does collapse because I'm not there, then I built something unstable that deserved to collapse anyway." He'd pulled her close. "Dr. Chen would be proud. I'm releasing my need for control and learning to trust others." "You're mocking your therapist." "I'm mocking myself. There's a difference." He'd kissed the top of her head. "But she's right. I can't keep living like the weight of the world is entirely on my shoulders. It's not sustainable, and it's not fair to you." Marcus had successfully saved the investor relationship, negotiating terms that were actually better than what Roman would have pushed for. When Marcus had called with the news, Roman had felt the usual flash of competitiveness, the part of him that wanted to prove he could have done it better, but he'd pushed past it. "Excellent work," he'd said sincerely. "You handled that brilliantly." The Sunday check-ins evolved as the months passed. They'd started as formal, structured conversations, but by November, they'd become something more organic. Roman and Vivian would curl up on the couch together, coffee in hand, and just talk. About their weeks, about their fears, about their hopes, about the ways they were succeeding and the ways they were still struggling. "I almost told you I was too busy for our date this week," Roman had admitted one Sunday. "There's a presentation on Wednesday that I wanted to prepare for. But then I caught myself. Realized I was falling into the old pattern." "What did you do?" "Prepared during normal work hours instead of sacrificing our personal time. Radical concept." He'd smiled wryly. "The presentation will be fine. It doesn't have to be perfect." Roman Viscari, accepting that things don't have to be perfect. "I never thought I'd see the day." "Yeah, well, My therapist keeps pointing out that my perfectionism is just another form of control, and that it's exhausting everyone around me, myself included. Vivian had snuggled closer. For what it's worth, I like you better imperfect. Yeah. Yeah, perfect Roman was intimidating and distant. Imperfect Roman is human. I can love human. The holidays approached, and for the first time in years, Vivian actually looked forward to them. Usually, the season was a marathon of obligatory events. Roman's company party, various client dinners, charity galas that all blurred together into an exhausting parade of small talk and forced smiles. This year, Roman had cut their commitments in half. We're going to the company party because it's important to the staff, he'd said, reviewing their calendar together. And the Children's Hospital Gala because we're on the board. But the rest? We're sending our regrets. People will talk. Let them. I'd rather have quiet evenings at home with you than spend every night in December making small talk with people I don't actually like. They'd spent those quiet evenings decorating their house, something they'd never done together before. Roman had always just had staff handle it, but this year, Vivian had insisted they do it themselves. They'd argued about where the tree should go, made a mess with garland, and ended up laughing on the floor surrounded by ornaments when Roman had somehow gotten tinsel in his hair. I'm terrible at this, he'd said, trying to untangle himself. You're terrible at relaxing and having fun, Vivian had corrected, helping him. But you're getting better. On Christmas Eve, they'd had dinner with Vivian's parents. Her mother had pulled her aside while Roman was helping her father with something in the garage. He's different, her mother had said. Roman, he seems softer somehow. He's doing a lot of work on himself. We both are. Are you happy, sweetheart? Vivian had thought about it, really thought about it. Yeah, Mom, I am. It's not perfect, and we still have hard days. But I'm happy. Her mother had hugged her tight. That's all I wanted for you. The new year brought new challenges. Vivian's graduate program intensified, demanding more of her time and energy. She had critique sessions that ran late into the evening, group projects with classmates half her age, readings that took hours to get through. Roman had stepped up without being asked, taking over more of the household management, making sure there was dinner when she got home late, giving her space to focus on her work. I feel like I'm neglecting you, Vivian had said one night, buried in research for a paper on contemporary abstract expressionism. You're not neglecting me. You're pursuing your dreams. There's a difference. Roman had brought her tea, kissed her temple. I spent 6 years demanding that you prioritize my career. The least I can do is support yours. In February, Vivian had her first solo critique with Professor Reeves. She'd brought her entire portfolio, the old paintings full of loneliness and pain, and the newer ones that showed growth and hope and the messy complexity of healing. Judith had studied them for a long time. These tell a story, she'd finally said, a complete narrative arc of suffering and transformation. Have you thought about showing them as a series? I haven't really thought about showing them at all. They're so personal. The best art is personal. It's how we connect with other people, by being brave enough to show them our truth. Judith had looked at her seriously. I want to put you forward for the Spring Graduate Showcase. It's competitive, but I think you have a real shot. Vivian had been terrified and excited in equal measure. The showcase was a big deal. Critics attended, gallery owners scouted for new talent, and pieces sometimes sold for significant amounts. It was exposure she hadn't expected to get until much later in her career. She'd told Roman that night, and he'd insisted on taking her out to celebrate. This is huge, he'd said over champagne. You're going to be in a real show. It's not guaranteed. Professor Reeves is just nominating me. There's a selection committee. You'll get in. Your work is incredible. You're biased. I'm honest. I know good work when I see it, and yours is exceptional. He'd raised his glass. To my wife, the artist, who's going to be famous one day. I don't want to be famous. I just want to create things that matter. Then to creating things that matter. The selection committee had chosen her work for the showcase in March. When she'd gotten the news, Vivian had cried in the middle of the campus coffee shop, overwhelmed by the validation and the fear of putting herself out there so publicly. The opening was scheduled for mid-April, and as it approached, Vivian had become increasingly anxious. These paintings were her soul on canvas, her pain, her struggle, her marriage laid bare for anyone to see and judge. What if people hated them? What if critics tore them apart? What if she'd made a mistake being so vulnerable? Roman had found her in the studio the night before the opening, staring at her paintings and second-guessing everything. "What if I'm not ready for this?" she'd asked. "You're ready. You've been ready." He'd put his hands on her shoulders. "I know you're scared, but remember what you told me when I was terrified of changing, that fear means it matters, that if it wasn't important, it wouldn't scare you. Using my own words against me. That's fighting dirty. I learned from the best." He'd turned her to face him. "You're allowed to be scared. You're allowed to worry that people won't understand or appreciate what you've created. But you're showing up anyway. That's courage." The opening had been everything Vivian had feared and hoped for. The gallery was packed, her classmates, professors, strangers who'd come to see the graduate showcase. Her parents were there, beaming with pride. Marcus had shown up with his wife, surprising Vivian with his support. And Roman. Roman had stood beside her all evening, introducing her to people not as my wife, but as Vivian Hale, the artist. He'd listened to her explain her work to curious viewers, watched her face light up when someone connected with a piece, held her hand when a critic asked pointed questions about her technique. One painting in particular had drawn a lot of attention, the portrait she'd created a year ago on their forgotten anniversary. A gallery owner named Patricia Chen had studied it for 20 minutes, asking Vivian questions about her process, her influences, her vision. "This one is special," Patricia had said finally. "It's devastating and beautiful and completely honest. Would you be interested in a solo show at my gallery? 6 months from now, we could do a full retrospective of your work." Vivian had been too stunned to speak. Roman had squeezed her hand, grounding her. Yes," she'd managed. "Yes, I'd be honored." Patricia had handed her a business card. "Call me next week. We'll discuss details." After she'd walked away, Vivian had turned to Roman with wide eyes. "Did that just happen?" "It happened. Because you're talented and people can see it." He'd pulled her into a hug right there in the middle of the gallery, not caring who was watching. "I'm so proud of you." Later that night, after the gallery had closed and they'd gone home, Vivian and Roman had sat on their terrace with wine and leftover cake someone had brought to the opening. "This has been the strangest year," Vivian had said, looking out at the garden that no longer felt like part of a prison. "Strange good or strange bad? Strange good, strange necessary." She'd turned to him. "A year ago, I had suitcases packed and was ready to walk away from you forever. Now I have a gallery show booked and a husband who knows my favorite coffee order. It feels like a completely different life." "It is a different life," Roman had said. "We're different people than we were. I'm different anyway. I hope better. Definitely better. Still imperfect and sometimes frustrating, but better. I'll take it." He'd set his wine down and taken both her hands. "I need to tell you something." "Okay?" "I've been thinking about stepping back from the company, not entirely, but significantly. Maybe taking on a chairman role instead of CEO, letting Marcus run the day-to-day operations." Vivian had stared at him. "Are you serious? Your company is your life." "It was my life, but it doesn't have to be my whole life. And I've realized over this past year that I built the company partly because I was good at it, but mostly because it gave me a place to hide. Somewhere I could be in control and never have to feel vulnerable." He'd met her eyes. "I don't want to hide anymore. And I don't want to spend the next 20 years sacrificing the things that actually matter for the things that just make me feel important." "What brought this on?" "Honestly, watching you at the opening tonight, seeing you come alive talking about your work, connecting with people over something you created. That's real success, real fulfillment. I've spent 20 years chasing deals and acquisitions, and none of it has ever made me feel the way you look tonight." He'd smiled, a little sad. "I want that. I want to find the thing that makes me feel alive instead of just accomplished. Do you know what that is? Not yet. But I'm willing to spend time figuring it out. Maybe I'll teach business courses at the university. Maybe I'll do consulting work. Maybe I'll finally write that book I've been threatening to write for a decade." He'd shrugged. "The point is, I have options. And for the first time in my adult life, I'm not terrified of exploring them." They talked late into the night about what that transition might look like, what Roman stepping back might mean for both of them. It was the kind of conversation they couldn't have had a year ago. Honest, vulnerable, full of uncertainty, but also hope. Over the next few months, Roman had begun the process of transitioning to chairman. Marcus had stepped into the CEO role with Roman's full support, and the company had continued to thrive. Roman had discovered that the world didn't end when he stopped trying to control everything, and that he was actually happier with more space in his life for things that weren't work. He'd started teaching a graduate seminar on corporate strategy at the business school, which he'd claimed to be doing as a favor, but clearly loved. He joined the board of the Institute of Fine Arts, becoming Vivian's biggest advocate in the academic arts community. He'd taken up running, something he'd never had time for before, and had convinced Vivian to join him for early morning jogs through the park. "I hate this," Vivian had panted one morning, struggling to keep up. "You love it," Roman had countered, barely winded. "I love you. I tolerate the running." Same thing. The solo show Patricia had offered turned into a huge success. Vivian had sold 12 of her 15 paintings, gotten write-ups in 3 major art publications, and received commissions from collectors who'd seen her work. She'd been terrified leading up to it, convinced that success would somehow jinx everything. But Roman had been there every step of the way. "What if this changes things?" she'd asked him the night before her opening. "It will change things," he'd said calmly. "You'll be busier. You'll have more demands on your time. People will want pieces of you that you didn't know you had to give." He'd pulled her close. "But we'll figure it out. Just like we figured out how to rebuild our marriage. One day at a time, with honesty and effort." The opening had been packed. Vivian's parents had flown in for it. Some of her graduate school classmates had shown up to support her. And Roman had been there from start to finish, watching her navigate conversations with collectors and critics with a pride that was visible to everyone in the room. When a journalist had asked him how it felt to have a wife with a burgeoning art career, Roman had said something that later got quoted in the article. "It feels like watching someone who was dimmed for too long finally get to shine at full brightness. I'm just grateful I get to be here to see it." One evening in late September, almost a year after the night Vivian had packed her suitcases, they'd found themselves back on the terrace where they'd had that first real conversation about saving their marriage. The air was crisp with the beginning of autumn, and the garden was preparing for winter. "Do you ever think about that night?" Roman had asked. "When you were leaving?" "All the time," Vivian had admitted. "Sometimes I can't believe I stayed. Sometimes I'm terrified I made the wrong choice, and I just haven't realized it yet." "Do you regret it?" She'd thought about it honestly. "No. But I also know that if you'd asked me to stay without being willing to change, if you'd made promises and not followed through, I would have left eventually. What we have now only works because we both did the work. We're both still doing the work. I'm grateful you gave me the chance," Roman had said quietly. "I know I didn't deserve it." "Maybe not, but marriage isn't about deserving. It's about choosing. Every single day, we choose this. We choose to be honest when it's hard. We choose to show up when it would be easier to retreat. We choose each other over our fear and our pride and our old patterns." "I choose you," Roman had said, taking her hand. "Today and tomorrow, and every day after that. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." "I choose you too," Vivian had said. "The imperfect, still learning, sometimes frustrating you. Because that's the real you, and he's worth choosing." They'd sat there as the sun set, two people who'd nearly lost each other and had fought their way back to something better than what they'd started with. It wasn't the fairy tale Vivian had imagined on her wedding day. It was messier than that, more complicated, more real. But it was theirs, built on a foundation of hard-won trust and the courage to be vulnerable. The mansion that had once felt like a prison had become a home. Not because anything about the building had changed, but because the people inside it had changed. They'd learned to see each other, to choose each other, to build something together that wasn't based on appearances or expectations, but on genuine connection. Vivian's career continued to grow. She'd had 3 more shows over the following year, each one more successful than the last. She'd finished her MFA with honors and had been offered a teaching position at the Institute, which she'd accepted. Her work was being collected by museums, featured in textbooks on contemporary art. She'd become the person she'd always had the potential to be, but had been too dimmed by her unhappy marriage to become. And Roman had found a version of success that wasn't measured in profit margins and market dominance. He'd written a book on ethical leadership that had become required reading in business schools. His seminar was always over-enrolled, with students drawn to his honest approach to discussing failure and growth. He'd become a mentor to young entrepreneurs, teaching them that building a successful company wasn't worth much if you destroyed your personal life in the process. He still had bad days, Moments when the old instinct to control everything would flare up, when he'd catch himself falling into patterns of emotional distance. But he recognized them now. He'd apologize, recalibrate, remind himself why he was doing this hard work of changing. They still had their Sunday check-ins, though they'd evolved into something less formal and more natural. They still went on weekly dates, though sometimes those dates were just walking through the farmer's market or cooking dinner together. They still went to therapy, Roman individually and both of them together, because they'd learned that maintaining a healthy relationship required ongoing effort, not just a one-time fix. On their 9th anniversary, Vivian and Roman had gone back to the small Italian restaurant that had become their place. Over pasta and wine, they'd reflected on how far they'd come. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd actually left that night?" Vivian had asked. "All the time," Roman had admitted. "I think about the man I was then, the man who would have let you walk out the door and then convinced himself it was your fault for being unreasonable. And I'm grateful I didn't get to be that man, that you forced me to become someone better. I didn't force you. You chose to change, because you gave me a reason to, because you were brave enough to demand more, to refuse to settle for a marriage that looked good but felt empty." He'd reached across the table for her hand. "You saved my life, Vivian. Maybe not literally, but in every way that matters. You saved me from becoming a bitter, lonely man who confused success with happiness." "You saved mine too," Vivian had said softly, "by being willing to do the work, by proving that people can actually change if they want to badly enough. I was so close to giving up on love entirely, on believing that real partnership was possible. You showed me it was." They'd toasted to their imperfect, hard-won, deeply real marriage, to the years of struggle that had brought them here, to the future they were building together, one honest conversation at a time, because that was the truth they'd both learned. Love wasn't enough on its own. Passion faded, attraction waned, feelings fluctuated. What lasted was choice, the daily decision to show up, to be vulnerable, to do the work even when it was uncomfortable, the commitment to keep choosing each other, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. Vivian had learned that she couldn't love someone into changing, couldn't sacrifice herself trying to heal wounds she didn't create. But she'd also learned that when someone was genuinely willing to do the work, when they were brave enough to face their own damage and committed enough to push through the discomfort of growth, then real transformation was possible. Roman had learned that control was an illusion, that perfectionism was a prison, and that the vulnerability he'd spent decades avoiding was actually the key to everything he'd been missing. He'd learned that true strength wasn't about never showing weakness. It was about being honest enough to ask for help, humble enough to admit mistakes, and brave enough to keep trying even when change felt impossible. They'd both learned that marriage wasn't about finding someone who completed you, or fixed you, or made everything easy. It was about finding someone you were willing to grow with, even when that growth was painful. It was about building something together that was stronger than what either person could create alone. Years later, when people asked Vivian about her marriage, she never painted it as a fairy tale. She was honest about how close she'd come to leaving, about the years of loneliness and disconnection, about the hard work of rebuilding trust. But she was also honest about what they'd gained through that struggle. "We almost lost everything," she'd say. "But in fighting to save our marriage, we found something better than what we started with. We found a real partnership built on honesty and effort and the courage to be imperfect together." And Roman, when asked about his greatest accomplishment, would sometimes surprise people by not mentioning his business success, or his best-selling book, or the companies he'd helped build. "My greatest accomplishment," he'd say, "was learning to be the kind of man my wife deserved. Not perfect, I'll never be perfect, but present, honest, willing to keep growing. That's worth more than any deal I ever closed." The mansion that had once felt like a beautiful cage had become a real home, filled with Vivian's paintings and Roman's books and the accumulated evidence of a life built together. The garden bloomed with roses Vivian had chosen herself, not just what the landscapers thought looked best. The studio was a constant work in progress, canvases in various stages of completion telling the ongoing story of Vivian's artistic journey. And in the bedroom they now shared comfortably, the suitcases Vivian had packed that desperate night sat empty in the back of a closet, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Sometimes she'd look at them and feel a chill, remembering the woman who'd been ready to walk away. But mostly, she felt grateful. Grateful for the courage it took to pack them and for the courage it took to unpack them and stay. Because in the end, that was what their story was about. Courage. The courage to demand more, to refuse to settle, to walk away if necessary. And the courage to stay when staying meant facing hard truths and doing difficult work. The courage to keep choosing love, even when love required change, growth, and the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone truly see you. Their marriage wasn't perfect. They still argued, still had moments of frustration and misunderstanding, still struggled sometimes to bridge the gap between two very different people learning to build a life together. But it was real. It was honest. It was built on a foundation of mutual respect and hard-won trust and the daily decision to keep showing up for each other. And that, Vivian had learned, was worth more than any fairy tale ending could ever be. Because fairy tales ended with happily ever after, as if happiness was a destination you reached and then stayed in forever. Real life was messier than that. Real love was choosing happiness again and again, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. She'd learned that she didn't need to be rescued or completed or saved. She needed to be seen, valued, and chosen every day by someone willing to do the work of actually knowing her. And Roman, for all his flaws and struggles and ongoing growth, gave her that. He'd learned that building an empire meant nothing if you had no one to share it with who actually knew you. That success without connection was just another form of loneliness. That the bravest thing he could do wasn't close another deal or build another company. It was open his heart to the woman he'd almost lost and trust that she wouldn't destroy him. Together, they'd learned that the best relationships weren't the easiest ones. They were the ones worth fighting for, worth changing for, worth showing up for even when you'd rather run. They were built not in moments of passion or grand gestures, but in thousands of small choices to be honest, to be present, to be real. And so they lived, not happily ever after in some static state of perfect contentment, but actively and imperfectly and honestly. Building a life that wasn't about appearances or expectations, but about two people who'd found each other, lost each other, and fought their way back to something better than either had known was possible. That was their victory. Not that they stayed together, but that they built something worth staying for. Not that they loved each other, but that they learned how to love each other well. Not that they had a perfect marriage, but that they had a real one, messy and difficult, and absolutely worth every bit of effort it required. And Vivian, looking back on the night she'd packed those suitcases, realized that the bravest thing she'd ever done wasn't walking away. It was knowing she could walk away, having the strength and self-worth to leave if she needed to, and using that power to demand the relationship she deserved. That knowledge, that she was choosing to stay rather than staying because she was trapped, changed everything. It gave her voice. It gave her power. It gave her the ability to build a partnership based on choice rather than obligation. Roman understood that too. He knew she stayed because she wanted to, not because she had to. And that knowledge kept him honest, kept him working, kept him showing up as the man she deserved rather than the man he'd been. Because he'd learned the hard way that taking someone for granted was the fastest way to lose them. And losing Vivian, really losing her, wasn't something he could survive twice. So they chose each other, every day, in 1,000 small ways and a few big ones. They chose honesty over comfort, growth over stagnation, presence over distance. They chose to keep building something real, something imperfect, something undeniably theirs. And that choice, repeated daily, tested constantly, renewed with each challenge they faced, was what transformed a marriage that had nearly ended into a partnership that would last. Not because it was easy, but because they both decided it was worth the work, worth the vulnerability, worth the risk of letting someone truly know you and trusting them not to weaponize that knowledge, but to treasure it. In the end, that was the only happy ending that mattered. Not perfection, but presence. Not fairy tales, but truth. Not rescuing or being rescued, but two people standing together and choosing to face whatever came next as partners, as equals, as two imperfect humans learning to love each other better every single day.